Hi, I'm Mary Drumond, and I host the Voices of CX podcast, where I talk to CX practitioners, thought leaders, and academics from various industries. Sometimes guests give us topics that deserve a bit more explanation. In CX in Context, we put those ideas in a practical business context so you can see why they matter and how to make them work for you. This is CX in Context. Hello and welcome back to CX in Context. I am your host, Mary Drumond. And this week on the podcast, we had a very special guest joining us. Now, if you've been around since the start of Voices of CX, firstly, thank you for sticking around. But our guest this week should sound very familiar. Crystal Garrett is back. Now, if you are new, Crystal is the original host of the podcast back in its first season and one of the main people that helped me come up with the concept of this podcast and even its name. It was amazing to take a walk down memory lane and reminisce on the good old days with Crystal and discuss how she is doing what she loves at her new job. So, during my conversation with natural-born storyteller Crystal Garrett, we got deeply into the importance of her job and why it's crucial for organizations to get on board with storytelling. Connecting with people through stories is deeply ingrained in our nature throughout our entire existence as a race. Stories have been a way to preserve history, memory, people. You see, in the fields of psychology and behavioral science, it is already a well-established fact that while people tend to forget almost everything that happens along the course of their lives, they do remember how something made them feel. And that means that forming an emotional connection between your brand and your customers through stories is the surest way to make sure they remember you out of all of the other players in this overly crowded, hyper-commoditized market that we live in. Now, another issue that we explored is the somewhat obvious yet surprisingly rare concept of simply treating people like people. We addressed this earlier in the season with Amelia Dunlop, but both Crystal and I truly value and try to live by this concept every day. Breaking down the barrier of treating your customers like people once and for all allows you to connect with them in a way that feels authentic and true, whether your customer is a person or a company. Because ultimately, companies are simply a group of people working together towards a collective goal. And an authentic, emotional connection with the people behind a brand is just as important as connecting directly with consumers. Now, this concept shouldn't stop there. It should also apply to the people that we work with day in and day out. Now, while I understand that every office dynamic is slightly different, speaking from my personal experience as an executive, being able to see my coworkers and peers as people first allows me to not only uncover and highlight their strengths and find how they can best add value to the organization, it also allows me to tap into their passions and talents so that they can feel fulfilled working with what they love and loving what they do. And lastly, as discussed in Jonathan Schroyer's episode, happy employees do in fact make happy customers. And happy employees tend to do a better job of listening, empathizing, and responding in a way that makes customers feel validated and acknowledged. This not only touches the frontline employees, it can also change the way internal teams work and collaborate to create processes and structures that always put the customer first. So here's a clip of the amazing conversation I had with Crystal on the podcast last week. When you're writing, whether it's a blog, whether it's a resource, a social media, do you always have a persona in mind when you start writing? The reason I'm asking this is because I watched Anne Handley, who's a really famous copywriter, speaking, and a story that she shared. I believe I've shared this story on the podcast before, but I'm going to say it anyway. She talked about Warren Buffett, and she talked about Warren Buffett's letters to shareholders, which is essentially a letter that Berkshire Hathaway puts out once a year to their shareholders, and it became bestsellers. And there were like 5 volumes or even more of letters to the shareholder. Who reads that? Well, everyone does, in fact. And the reason that they do is because of the way that Buffett gets this message across. And one of the things that he talks about is how whenever he's going to write that letter to his shareholders, the person that he imagines, the persona that he imagines, and who he writes that to is his sister. And his sister is not in finances. She's not a big Wall Street buff. I believe she's a teacher. So she's highly educated. She's very intelligent, but she's not involved in the day-to-day of the finance world. So when he shares his points of view, his analysis, he does it for her. And he figures that if he can get that across to somebody who isn't in finance, then everyone will be able to get it.
Can understand it.
And that's, for me, that was amazing. And that changed the way that I write copy. It changed the way I write newsletters. I pick a persona and I write to them every time. Do you do that too? Is that something that you do?
Sometimes, not always. But what we do try to do is no jargon, just talk to people like people talk, not talking above them, not talking at them. And the thought is always to help them do their job better, help make their day better, fulfill a need or want, spark a conversation. How do we do that? We do it by being relatable, feeling accessible. At least that's what we try to do at our brand. So no, we don't think about a particular persona. I'm in social. We don't think about a particular persona per se, but the approach is always the same.
So, Crystal, when you're working, how important is it for you to provide your readers with a sense of value as soon as they're done with that piece? Because that's one thing that happens a lot. And it's what I talked about. A lot of people got burned by reading vendor blog posts and believing that they were going to find something valuable. And at the end, they just wasted their time with empty copy. So is there
it all sounds
an
the
exercise?
Same.
Yeah. Is there an exercise that you do while you're writing where you make sure that at the end there's something valuable that's being gotten across with that piece?
I think what I aim to do, at least, is to look at the pain point first, examine what it is that's missing, that's needed, what answers that they're searching for, find a solution and give them some key takeaways that they could use in their daily work.
If you would like to hear the entire conversation I had with Crystal Garrett, including how we got this podcast started, the link will be in the description below. Thank you once again for tuning in to another episode of CX in Context, and we'll see you next time. Voices of CX is brought to you by VoCX, the only VOC platform that uses AI on the front end to augment your VOC. I'm Mary Drumond. CX in Context is hosted by me, co-produced and edited by Steve Barry and Ashley Alufahai. Be sure to check out the full episode linked in the description. See you on the next episode.